Hi, Brian here. So my original research objective was, how does European environmental policy differ from that of other industrialized nations and regions? And are there specific European policy actions and strategies for addressing climate change that the rest of us should be doing? So I picked this line of inquiry because I'm also studying pollution in public policy, and like you, I'm very concerned about climate change. So my thesis evolved with research and moved on to become, how did Europe become the global leader in environmental policies and protections? Because when you look at the record, during the 70s and 80s, the U.S. was the undisputed leader with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and a host of other legislation that emerged during that time. So my research revealed there were some pretty unexpected factors, namely that Europe became the global leader in environmental policy and climate change action because of economic considerations. There was also a big piece played by minority party politics, which I'll get into in a second. So my sources described how the EU went from being relatively indifferent to environmental concerns during the 60s and to today, where it's kind of the centerpiece of the European identity. Certainly there's genuine concern, but there's also a cost associated with environmental policy compliance. And there is a patchwork of regulation across Europe. One of the main points, if not the main point, of the EU is to provide for the free movement of goods, people, and capital across the region. But if one country had stricter regulations, then they'd be at a competitive disadvantage due to their higher regulatory costs. So the EU Commission had to harmonize regulations across the region in order to level the playing field. But then the issue became how to remain competitive with trading partners outside the EU that might be carrying less environmental compliance costs and regulation. It was and is clearly in Europe's interest to promote their standards as the global standards. Again, this doesn't mean that their motives weren't pure, but just that it's more complicated than simply wanting to have the best environment. Regarding the minority party politics, the parliamentary form of democracy, like in Europe, relies on various parties forming coalitions in order to get things done. This makes it much more likely that a new or minority party will gain some influence than it would here in the U.S., where politics tends to be dominated by interest groups and big money. The Greens in Europe have been around for over 30 years, and at this point they're considered relatively mainstream. Additionally, in social welfare states like in Europe, platforms like the Greens that include things like social justice initiatives and environmental protections resonate with the electorate much more than they do in the U.S. So while the Green Party is considered fringe in the U.S., it's emerged as a highly influential party in the EU, as demonstrated in last month's elections. So in conclusion, parliamentary democracy enabled the Green Party to become a major influence in European politics, first in the national governments and then in the European Parliament. This resulted in a patchwork of relatively strong environmental legislation that has since fallen under common EU standards. In order to remain competitive, first with the fellow union members, and then later, due to globalization, with other markets, the EU has to promote those standards externally. And since the U.S. has moved from leadership to obstructionist, well, at least with regards to international environmental agreements, the EU has stepped in to fill the void. And that's my paper in a nutshell. Thanks.